Where is Ambassador Hall? Where are the human records?
Chairman, please step away from the platform. Who is Ambassador Hall?
The human ambassador. He sat there yesterday.
Chairman, there has never been a human delegation.
Stop lying! I chaired this council with them yesterday!
Marcus, you were alone yesterday.
Then why am I the only one who remembers them?
The spire had a smell to it. That was the first thing most new delegates noticed when they arrived. This faint, almost pleasant mixture of recycled air and warm circuitry, layered underneath whatever biological signature the 1,000-odd species packed into its corridors happened to be giving off that particular cycle. After 30 years, Marcus Vale had stopped noticing it entirely. The spire smelled like work. It smelled like the place you went because someone had to run things, and you were the one who had volunteered. He was already reviewing the morning's agenda before he reached the chamber doors. Agricultural tariffs from the Vela corridor, tonnage disputes between the Keth mining guilds and the independent haulers, a border arbitration request from the Aran system that had been sitting in his queue for 6 weeks and would probably sit there another 6 if he let it. Marcus was not, by nature, a man who let things sit. 42 years in diplomatic service had given him a particular relationship with efficiency, not obsessive, but close. He tapped 2 notations into his datapad without breaking stride, handed his outer robe to an aide who materialized from somewhere to his left, and pushed through the chamber doors at precisely 800 hours. The amphitheater was arranged in its usual concentric arcs, each tier of seating assigned to a specific delegation, each desk carrying the quiet weight of whichever crisis its occupants had carried in from the outer sectors. The Keth delegates were already arguing with each other in low, clicking undertones. Ambassador Pree from the Aran Coalition had fallen asleep in her chair, which was not unusual. The bioluminescent strips running along the ceiling pulsed in their standard morning cycle, casting everything in a clean, neutral white. Marcus walked to his position at the head of the central table and set down his datapad. He did not look at the far left arc immediately. He was pulling up the tariff documentation, cross-referencing it against the tonnage figures Roland had sent him the night before. Roland Drex, his Minister of Logistics, had a habit of sending 17-page summaries at midnight with the subject line brief overview, and Marcus had learned to actually read them because Roland was almost never wrong about anything, which was its own particular kind of exhausting. Session convened at 800, he said, his voice carried easily. He had been told he had a good chamber voice, which he suspected was less a compliment about his vocal quality and more a polite way of saying he was loud. Let us move through the Vela corridor tariffs first. I want the grain allocation figures settled before the midday break. Silence, not the kind that meant people were listening, the kind that meant something was wrong. Marcus looked up. The left arc, the human delegation section, was empty. Not empty in the sense of a delayed arrival or a morning absence. Empty in the specific, careful way that a space becomes empty when everything that was ever in it has been removed. The desks had been stripped, not just of people, but of everything. The holographic projectors were dark, their emitter nodes pulled cleanly from their mounts. The small personal items that accumulated on desks over years of occupation, the data stacks, the personal screens, the half-organized reference documents were gone. Even the standard issue water carafe that Edmund Hall kept at his right elbow through every session without exception, the one he never actually drank from but seemed to consider a structural component of the desk itself, was gone. Marcus stood very still. "Where is Ambassador Hall?" he said. His own voice sounded strange to him. It echoed slightly, which it shouldn't have. The acoustic panels in the chamber were calibrated by the Spire's audio technicians, human audio technicians, he thought, without quite understanding why he was thinking it to absorb excess resonance. The fact that his voice was bouncing off the walls told him that calibration had not happened this morning. "Roland," he said, turning. "Did they log a delay?" Roland Drex was already at his console, and he did not look up when Marcus spoke to him. He looked the way a man looks when he has found something in a dataset that he does not want to have found. He was 47 years old and had the kind of face that defaulted to composed under pressure. But the composure was doing visible work right now. "No delay logged," Roland said. "Their diplomatic calendar." He paused. "It's been wiped, not corrupted, wiped. Authorized deletion from their own terminals. Sarah Voss used her access credentials at 300 hours this morning. She purged the calendar, disconnected their server cluster from the compact mainframe, revoked their read permissions on our logistics grid." Marcus sat down slowly. He did not have a conscious decision to sit down. His legs simply made the choice for him. A protest, he said. He was already running through the recent history the new border levy on human merchant traffic, which the human delegation had formally objected to in writing 3 times, which Marcus had formally tabled 3 times, which had created a specific frost in his interactions with Edmund that he had been meaning to address and kept not addressing. Edmund throws a tantrum when he thinks he's been ignored long enough. He'll come back with a list of demands and we'll negotiate. That's how this works. Sir, Roland said. There was something different in his voice. Not quite alarm, more like the moment before alarm. When you have the information but your body hasn't finished processing what to do with it yet. I pinged the human residential compound in the lower ward. The automated response I received was not a lockout protocol. It was a vacancy notification. Marcus looked at him. The lease, Roland said, has been terminated. The sound that went through the chamber was not quite a murmur. It was more like a collective intake of breath that nobody had agreed to take simultaneously. Humans did not terminate leases. This was not an opinion, it was a documented behavioral pattern spanning decades of diplomatic record. The human delegation had once spent 6 months in formal arbitration over the square footage of their archival storage room. A dispute Marcus had eventually settled by giving them an additional 14 square meters just to stop receiving the correspondence. Sarah Voss, Edmund's chief of staff, had personally overseen the measurement of those 14 square meters with a physical measuring device, apparently because she did not trust the Spire's internal survey tools. She had then filed a counter-dispute about the wall thickness being included in the measurement. That woman did not abandon a lease. Send a runner, Marcus said. Get eyes on the compound. The runner came back in 2 hours. What she brought was footage from the compound's internal security system. The kind of footage that gets projected onto the central display of the council chamber and watched by 400 representatives of 400 different species. In a silence so complete, you could hear the ventilation cycling. The timestamp started at 100 hours. The compound's main corridor, normally quiet at that hour, showed human personnel moving. They were carrying crates, not in a rush, not in panic moving the way people move when they have a very clear picture of what needs to happen, and a reasonable amount of time in which to make it happen. No talking, no hesitation, just the quiet, systematic reduction of a presence that had existed in that compound for 30 years. They took the server racks. They took the encrypted data drives. They took the atmospheric calibration equipment that the Spire's engineering department had asked to borrow twice and been politely declined both times. They took, according to the runner's inventory, the coffee machines, 3 of them. The last image in the sequence was Edmund Hall standing at the main airlock. He was wearing a heavy coat, the dark wool one he'd had since, before Marcus had known him. The one that was slightly too formal for a casual departure and slightly too worn for a ceremonial one. He looked at the door panel for a moment, keyed in a sequence, heard the lock engage, and walked out without once turning around. He didn't look angry, Roland said. His voice had gone quiet. He looked tired. Marcus stared at the frozen image. Edmund's back, the set of his shoulders, the particular way a person holds themselves when they have made a decision they are not going to revisit. Where is the 9th Fleet? Marcus said. The 9th Peacekeeping Flotilla had been stationed at the Outer Rim under Commander Nathan Cross for 11 years. 11 years of holding a border that other species militias had tried and largely failed to hold before them. Roland's fingers moved across his console. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was completely flat, gone. Their transponders went dark at 200 hours. The entire flotilla broke orbit simultaneously and made the jump. Standard human warp signatures. They were heading inward, toward Terra. The chamber broke. Not in the dramatic sense, not tables overturned, not shouting matches, not the theatrical chaos that Marcus had seen in genuine emergency sessions. It broke in the way that a crowd breaks when the news is bad enough that people stop performing their reactions and start actually having them. Delegates talking over each other. Not for effect, but because they were genuinely frightened. The word war surfaced several times in several languages. Carried on the current of translation microbes that hummed in every compact representative's inner ear. Marcus did not look away from the display. He looked at Edmund's back and he thought about the word tired. You recalled a war footing when you were preparing to fight. You recalled your fleets and vacated your embassy and wiped your calendars when you had decided, at some fundamental level, that the argument was over. Marcus had been in enough negotiations to know what it looked like when someone was done. When they had stopped calculating what they might still get and started calculating what it would cost to stay in the room another hour. He had seen that posture before. He had watched people cross that line. He had just never watched an entire civilization do it simultaneously and quietly, without a single message, without a single shot, without even the small dignity of a formal declaration. The assembly, Marcus thought, had expected a spectacle, a dramatic ultimatum, humanity throwing its weight around in public, making demands, forcing a renegotiation. That was the playbook. That was how these things went. But Edmund Hall had not left his people's playbook. He had left Marcus's. 50 years, Roland said. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. He was looking at the logistics map on his secondary screen, watching the red indicators multiply. 50 years. And we never once asked ourselves what happens if they decide to stop. Marcus had no answer for that. He looked at the chamber, the noise, the fear, the sudden scrambling of political animals who had spent decades in a system. They understood, discovering that the system had changed without their input, and felt something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the climate controls. He picked up his data pad. He looked at the morning agenda. Agricultural tariffs, tonnage disputes, a border arbitration request that was 6 weeks overdue. The grain allocation figures, he said quietly, are not going to be settled before the midday break. Nobody was listening to him, which was, he supposed, appropriate. Outside the spire's observation windows, the traffic lanes that normally carried the dense, organized flow of human merchant vessels, the cargo haulers, the supply runners, the sleek diplomatic transports bearing the quiet blue and white insignia of Terra were empty, had been empty since 200 hours. When the Ninth Fleet made its jump and the last of the human navigation beacons went dark, the sky looked like a sentence with the subject removed. You could see the shape of where the words had been. You could tell something was supposed to be there, but it wasn't, and the remaining words made no sense without it. 4 days later, Roland hadn't slept. This was not, on its own, unusual. Roland had gone long stretches without sleep before, during the Keth mineral crisis, during the Oran arbitration backlog, during any of the 17 situations over the past decade that he had privately categorized as the kind of thing that doesn't look like a crisis until it suddenly is. What was different this time was that the sleeplessness had a quality to it he didn't recognize. He'd run out of things to do, not for lack of problems. The problems were multiplying at a rate he'd stopped trying to track individually and had begun tracking as a single aggregate metric he'd labeled, with the specific grim humor of a man who had been awake for 91 hours. Total systemic failure percentage. It was at 43. His aide, a young clerk named Pell who had been assigned to him 6 months ago and who Roland had initially found somewhat irritating and now found invaluable, appeared in the doorway holding physical printouts, which told Roland more about the current state of the compact's digital networks than any of his monitors. The grain shipments from Sector 9, Pell said. They haven't moved. Roland rubbed his eyes. Why? The navigational beacons along the corridor are down. The haulers won't jump without them. Send a maintenance team. We did, sir. Pell's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. The maintenance teams are compact engineers. They can interface with the hardware, but the beacon software is human-built. Open-source architecture written entirely in standard Terran syntax. Without someone who knows the codebase, there's no way to run diagnostics. The beacons are just sitting there. Roland closed his eyes. Reroute the haulers. Long way around. That's 3 weeks added to the transit time. The grain will spoil. Roland opened his eyes and looked at his desk. The stack of printouts Pell had brought were covered in red margin notes, which was something Pell did that Roland had found irritating for the first 3 months and now found deeply reassuring because it meant Pell had actually read everything before bringing it to him. He picked up the top sheet. The beacons had been installed by human engineering teams 8 years ago. The maintenance schedule had been handled by human technicians. The maintenance schedule had been so reliable that it had stopped appearing in Roland's weekly briefings because there was nothing to report, no delays, no failures, no budget overruns. It had simply worked. Roland had a category in his logistics framework for systems that simply worked. He called it baseline infrastructure. He did not spend a lot of time thinking about baseline infrastructure. He was starting to understand that this had been a significant oversight. Outside his window, the spire's traffic lanes were still mostly empty. The human merchant fleet, the backbone of interstellar commerce for 50 years. The thing that had made the compact's ambitious trade network actually function was gone. What remained was sparse and slow and increasingly erratic. As automated systems ran without the human traffic controllers who had spent their careers compensating for the lag in old algorithms, anticipating errors before they cascaded, doing in real time the kind of intuitive management that no software had ever quite been able to replicate. The Spire's traffic control system, left to its own devices, was not managing traffic. It was following rules. And the rules, it turned out, were a very rough approximation of what the human controllers had actually been doing. Marcus walked in without knocking. He did this sometimes, which Roland had learned to accept. He looked, in Roland's assessment, roughly a decade older than he had a week ago. The particular dignity that came with being the High Chancellor of the Interstellar Compact, the posture, the deliberate calm, the sense that whatever was happening, the man in charge had already considered it was still present, but it was doing visible work. The way a structure is still standing while under load. The trade unions are threatening a strike, Marcus said. The docking bays are a mess. The automated bay systems, Roland said without looking up, were supervised by human traffic controllers. They didn't just monitor the displays. They managed the variance in real time when the old mainframe lagged, when a freighter came in hot, when 3 ships all needed the same dock simultaneously. Without that management, the automation is following its original programming, which was designed 30 years ago and was already out of date when the humans updated it. Marcus walked to Roland's window. He stood there for a moment, looking at the sparse, disorganized traffic below. Then he said, very quietly, "We need them back." Roland set down his printout. He had known this conversation was coming. He had been dreading it not because Marcus was wrong, but because Marcus was right in a way that didn't help anything. "I've tried everything," Roland said. "Subspace messages on every monitored frequency. Diplomatic couriers sent to the last known positions of their fleet. I even found the old analog broadcast channel they kept active for deep space emergencies." He paused. Nothing. No acknowledgement. No rejection. "It's like sending a message to a star. They want something," Marcus said, his voice taking on the specific edge it got when he was working a problem. "There's always a leverage point, a seat on the High Council, trade concessions. We should have offered Edmund a seat years ago. He wanted one. We give it to him. We give them whatever they need to come back." Roland was quiet for a moment. "Cornelius," he said, which was Marcus's old title. "The one that meant I'm about to tell you something you won't want to hear. And I'm reminding you that I'm not doing it to be difficult. Look at the footage again. Look at Edmund Hall walking out that door." Marcus looked at the still image on Roland's secondary monitor. Edmund's back, the heavy coat, the unhurried step. "That's not a man who wants a better offer," Roland said. "That's a man who's done offering." Marcus stared at the image for a long time. Then he said, "I sent a probe." Roland waited. "Yesterday, to the edge of the Vela system. I bypassed your authorization. I needed to know." Roland did not address the bypassed authorization. What did it find? Marcus pressed a key on Roland's console. The main monitor shifted from the logistics map from its spreading field of red indicators. Each one a system failing, a route closed, a community beginning to starve to something else entirely. The Vela system, Edmund Hall's system, Terra's system, except it wasn't right. The stars behind it were wrong. The light from the background field was bent in a way that light did not bend, wrapped around an invisible central point in slow, perfect arcs. Where the Vela system should have been, there was a sphere. Not a dark sphere in the visual sense, not a shadow or a blackout. A sphere of something that was not quite space. Bounded by a gravimetric field so dense that the sensors had initially classified it as a solid object before recategorizing it as a localized alteration of space-time. "They built a wall," Roland said. He heard his own voice from a distance. "Not a shield. Not a weapons platform. A fold, a quarantine. From the inside out. Nothing goes in. Nothing comes out. No ships, no signals, no light. They locked the door," Marcus said. He sat down heavily in Roland's visitor's chair. The chair was not designed for someone of Marcus's build and it creaked in protest, but he didn't seem to notice. Roland looked at the image, at the bend of the light, at the absolute, clinical, terrifying finality of what someone had to know about physics to build something like that. "They're really gone," Marcus said. He sounded like a man hearing a diagnosis he had suspected for a while, but had been hoping was wrong. "Yes," Roland said. Marcus looked at him. "What do we do?" Roland had no answer that was useful. He looked at his logistics map, at the 43% and climbing. He looked at the grain routes that weren't moving, and the border that wasn't being held, and the air filtration systems that were going to need maintenance in 18 days and had no one to maintain them. "We learn," Roland said finally, "to manage in the dark." He picked up his printout. The margin notes were very red. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside the window, a cargo hauler drifted into the wrong approach vector, and the automated bay system, faithful to its 30-year-old programming, did absolutely nothing about it. 3 weeks after the human exodus, the spire began to smell. Not all at once. It started in the lower corridors of Sector 4, which most of the High Council delegates had never visited and would not have recognized if someone had handed them a map. The lower sectors were where the spire's working population lived: the dock hands, the freight clerks, the mid-level administrative staff who kept the machinery of interstellar governance moving and were compensated for this service with housing that was technically within the Compact's flagship station and practically a different world from the crystalline galleries of the upper tiers. Roland had spent a fair amount of time in the lower sectors over the years, not because he was required to, but because the data on his screens made more sense when he occasionally went and looked at the things the data represented. The smell, when it reached him, was organic, wet and heavy, with an undertone of ozone that shouldn't have been there. He found the source 3 corridors down from the primary water reclamation hub. The biofiltration system, a sophisticated algae matrix that the human engineering teams had introduced to the spire's atmospheric processing cycle about 11 years ago, was dying. The algae itself was not visible from the maintenance corridor, but the access panel to its containment vats was open, and the air coming out of it had texture. Roland held a folded cloth over his nose and mouth and looked at what was happening. The algae had overgrown its containment fields. Without the human maintenance crews who had come down here on a rotating schedule, 3 times per cycle, to manually scrape the excess biomatter from the filtration grates and balance the nutrient mix and do whatever other quiet, unglamorous things they had done in here, the colony had expanded until its own density was killing it. The outer layers were dying and decomposing in place. The inner layers were suffocating on the biological waste of the outer layers. The whole system was collapsing from the outside in, and as it did so, the atmospheric processing capacity of Sector 4 was dropping by approximately 2% per day. 6 compact engineers stood in the corridor outside the panel. They were impeccably dressed for people standing in a humid maintenance tunnel that smelled like a swamp. Their equipment was clean. Their postures communicated a very specific kind of discomfort, not with the smell, or not only with the smell, but with the entire situation of being people who did not normally do this kind of work, being asked to do this kind of work. The chief technician was a man named Everest, who Roland knew from the Infrastructure Review Board and respected professionally while finding personally exhausting. Everest had very strong opinions about engineering standards. He communicated these opinions frequently and at length. "We cannot initiate a standard reset," Everest said, as Roland finished his visual assessment of the vats. "The base code is architecturally incoherent." Roland lowered the cloth from his face. He regretted this immediately. "Explain it to me simply." Everest pointed to the datapad connected to the access panel. "The primary pump command instructs the intake valve to open fully on a 3-second cycle, but there is a secondary subroutine embedded in the same directory that forces the valve to stutter open, then close by approximately 12%, then open again, on a loop, continuously. It directly contradicts the primary command. If we run the code as written, the logic core will fault within minutes and the entire system will lock." Roland stepped past Everest and looked at the datapad himself. The code was messy. It was written in standard Terran syntax, and the comment annotations, the little explanatory notes that programmers leave in the margins of their own work, were a mixture of technical shorthand and language that would have been considered unprofessional in a formal context. He read through 3 blocks of it before he understood what he was looking at. "This isn't a contradiction," Roland said. Everest frowned. "The logic is self-defeating. The valve cannot be simultaneously commanded to open fully and to stutter at 12%. It's a compensation," Roland said. He traced his finger along the pipe housing leading into the wall. The metal was slightly warped near the junction, barely visible, but there if you looked. "This valve is structurally compromised. The housing has been deformed, probably from thermal stress during the spire's expansion phase 15 years ago. If you open it all the way and hold it there, the pressure differential causes it to jam in the open position. Once it jams open, the whole filtration cycle floods. The stutter step is keeping it from sticking. The software is compensating for a hardware defect." Everest stared at him. Why would they not simply submit a repair request for the valve? Roland turned to look at him. He felt, at that moment, a specific and clarifying exhaustion. He had submitted those repair requests. He had been the one to deny them, 3 separate times over 4 years. Because the Compact's budget allocation process for lower sector maintenance did not have a category that adequately covered what Sarah Voss had described in her filings as localized structural anomalies in subgrade infrastructure components, which was accurate and specific and had nonetheless been classified as discretionary and deferred. He had told her to manage the situation with existing resources. She had managed the situation with existing resources. The situation had been managed so quietly and competently that it had never appeared in his reports again, and he had not thought about it again. And now he was standing in a dying filtration corridor, trying to explain to a senior engineer why the plumbing had been fixed with a software trick. Because I denied the repair request, Roland said. 4 times. Ivris opened his mouth. Do not rewrite the code, Roland said. Run it exactly as it is. The stutter step stays. You work around the mainframe's error flags manually, and you keep this system running. Because if it goes down, the air processing for Sector 4 fails within a week, and 300,000 people are breathing recycled toxins. Do you understand me? A long pause. The vats gurgled wetly in the background. The mainframe will continue to flag the logic as an error, Ivris said. Then we bypass the mainframe, Roland said. He heard the sharpness in his own voice and didn't moderate it. You bypass the mainframe and you run the ugly, broken, efficient code exactly as they wrote it, because there is nobody left to write better code. And the only alternative is letting the system fail. He left them in the corridor and walked until he reached the observation deck that overlooked the lower concourse. The thermal regulators in the residential blocks below had failed 2 days ago. Looking down at the concourse, he could see people gathered around portable chemical heaters in clusters, breath misting in the air. The commercial sector was empty. Storefronts that had been open for decades were dark and locked, their owners gone or consolidated inward with the rest of the sector's population as the habitable zones contracted. He pulled out his personal communicator and opened a direct channel to Marcus. The static was bad. It had been getting worse. The secure communication relays, which had been maintained by a rotation of human technicians who had apparently been doing preventive work that nobody had formally requested and nobody had formally tracked, were degrading at a rate that the Compact's engineering teams had assessed and then provided a repair timeline for that Roland had stopped believing in around day 6. High Chancellor, he said when the connection resolved. The atmospheric fault in Sector 4 is patched. Temporary. Roland. Marcus's voice came through with a metallic edge to it. How temporary? Days, maybe a week. We don't have personnel who understand the maintenance cycle. The engineers can hold it together manually for a while, but they're doing it blind. He paused. There are food riots developing in Sector 7. The automated freight handlers in the main dock are dropping cargo containers because the human traffic supervisors aren't there to compensate for the system lag. 3 cargo handlers were injured this morning. Contain the sector disturbances, Marcus said. The militia can. The militia is stretched across the docking bays, Roland said. We are hemorrhaging functionality at a rate I can't stabilize without more personnel than we have. And the personnel we have don't have the training for what needs to be done. We need to shut down the outer habitation rings, consolidate the population inward, reduce the surface load on the failing systems, buy ourselves time. A silence on the line that had nothing to do with the static. If we evacuate the outer rings, Marcus said finally, we signal a complete loss of control. The outer sector delegates are already threatening secession. If they see us contracting, they'll interpret it as collapse and accelerate the process. It is collapse, Roland said. Slowing it down is what I'm asking for, not stopping it. Another silence. Longer. I am at the edge of the Vela system, Marcus said. Roland stood very still. I took the Resolute out yesterday with a skeleton crew. We're sitting at the Oort boundary looking at the anomaly. I needed to see it directly. Marcus, Roland kept his voice level. The gravimetric readings from the probe showed a field density that would destroy any ship attempting transit. You cannot approach it. I have no intention of approaching it, Marcus said. I have a man here who says he knows a way through it. The man was named Gideon Rail. Roland had located him through 3 layers of criminal record archives and 1 favor owed by the Compact's intelligence division, which had been somewhat better at locating people who didn't want to be located before the human analysts in their data department had departed. Gideon Rail was 41 years old, had operated as a deep space courier and occasional smuggler across the Outer Rim for most of his adult life, had been serving a 12-year sentence in the Compact's correctional facility at Mira Station for trafficking violations, and had agreed to provide his services in exchange for a full pardon and a reasonable quantity of a specific Terran coffee blend that the Compact had located in the Spire's remaining stores. He was, by his own account, one of approximately 8 people who knew about the needle, which was what the independent couriers who ran the Vela corridor had called the microfracture in the local subspace layer that ran under the Oort boundary, not through it, under it, the quarantine field. Gideon had explained to Marcus in terms that Marcus had then explained to Roland over a degraded communications link, was a bubble. It enclosed the Vela system from above and below and every lateral direction. But bubbles had surface tension, and the needle was a subspace lane that predated the quarantine field, that ran beneath the level of space-time the field was anchored to, and that emerged, in theory, somewhere near the 4th planet's orbital path. Human couriers had used it for years, unofficially. The Compact's navigation charts didn't include it because it didn't align with standard geometric mapping protocols, and the Compact's cartographers had reviewed those protocols approximately never. "It is a suicide run," said Captain Varen, who commanded the Resolute and communicated her opinions about this mission with the particular directness of a 20-year military officer who had survived the Outer Rim border campaigns and did not intend to not survive this. "My objection is on record," Varen said. "For the 3rd time." "Noted," Marcus said. He was looking at the viewport. The Vela anomaly was not dramatic. From this distance, it was a bruise in the light field, a place where the background stars warped in slow, perfect arcs around the invisible central point of the gravimetric anchor. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might mistake it for an optical artifact, a sensor glitch. Gideon Rail, sitting at the primary navigation console in a flight jacket that predated several of the Compact's standing treaties, was entering coordinates manually. He had disabled the automated plotting software 18 minutes ago on the grounds that it would try to correct his inputs, and he did not have time to argue with it. "The field accounts for lateral and vertical approach vectors," Gideon said, without looking up from the console. "The math they used to build it is extremely sophisticated. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the needle runs at a subspace depth that's below the layer they anchored the field to. If I thread it right, we come out the other side inside the boundary. And if you thread it wrong," Varen said, "the gravimetric shear collapses the lane around us in about a quarter of a second." Gideon looked up briefly. "Nobody feels anything. It's not a dramatic ending," Marcus said. "Proceed." What happened next was not smooth. The Resolute entered the subspace fracture at the point Gideon had identified by memory and by a navigation method that appeared to involve significant intuition and a great deal of extremely rapid manual adjustment. The ship did not transition into warp travel the way it normally did, that smooth, momentary dissolution into faster-than-light transit that most interstellar travelers had experienced so many times it had become mundane. It lurched. The inertial compensation system made a sound that it was not supposed to make. Marcus was thrown against the edge of the command table hard enough to feel it in his shoulder, and the lights went to emergency red. And outside the viewport, the universe became something that was not darkness and was not light but was very loud. "The corridor is narrowing," Gideon said. His hands were moving faster than Marcus could follow. "The quarantine field is bleeding down into the subspace layer. It's compressing the fracture. The lane is collapsing under us. Structural integrity at 60%. An officer reported from the engineering station. 53:48. Compensate with the port stabilizers." "I'm trying. The standard calculations don't work in here. There's nothing to calculate against." Marcus pulled himself upright against the tilt of the deck and looked at the main display. The structural readout was a cascade of amber warnings turning red. Armor plating was being stripped from the hull by tidal forces that the ship's sensors classified as gravitational, but that didn't behave the way gravity was supposed to behave. The noise was constant and structural, not external. But the sound of the ship itself being worked by forces it was not designed to resist. Then the viewport went black, not the black of space, the black of the quarantine field's inner boundary, seen from below, which was apparently a solid wall of compressed space-time that registered on the Resolute's sensors as a material surface. They hit it. There was no explosion, no dramatic burst of energy or light. It felt like the ship had run at full speed into something that did not move and did not break. And all of the kinetic energy that had been moving the Resolute forward had to go somewhere and went everywhere else instead. The deck buckled. People went down. The primary drive core screamed. There was no better word for the sound it made. And then Gideon's fist came down on the emergency kill switch, and the drives died, and the Resolute was back in real space, tumbling. Artificial gravity failed for approximately 3 seconds. Then it returned, and everyone who had been floating came down hard. And the bridge was dark, except for the emergency strips along the floor. And someone was coughing. And somewhere below decks, a pressure seal had failed, and the evacuation alarm for Deck 7 was cycling through its tones in the red-lit silence. Marcus pushed himself off the floor. His left shoulder was wrong. He did not investigate how wrong. He got to the viewport. The Vela anomaly was undisturbed. The bruised light field. The perfect curve of bent starlight. The quarantine. Absolute and unmarked. As though the Resolute had not touched it at all. Status, he said. Varen pulled herself back into her command chair. Both primary drives are fused. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 9. Its sortiport is at 22% and dropping. We are adrift. Gideon sat at the navigation console and did not move. He was looking at his hands. There was blood on his face from somewhere above his hairline, and he had not acknowledged it. He sat very still for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, they didn't just build a wall. They set the anchor points in the subspace substrate. Below the lane. Below the lane. He stopped. There's no fracture left to thread. They found every crack and they sealed it. Marcus pressed his hand against the cold viewport glass. The anomaly hung in the middle distance, serene and complete, and he understood for the first time not as a political assessment, not as a strategic calculation, but as a fact of physics that there was no way in, no frequency to broadcast on, no back door, no leverage point, no negotiation to be had. They were locked out. He stood there for a while. Behind him, Varen was coordinating the damage response with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in bad situations before and knew that efficiency was the thing you held onto when everything else was failing. The evacuation alarm for Deck 7 kept cycling. The emergency lighting cast everyone in red. Send a distress signal, Marcus said. His voice came out level, which surprised him, to the nearest relay. Tell Roland to begin shutting down the outer habitation rings. He didn't move from the viewport for a long time after that. Back on the spire, Roland did not learn about the needle's failure until the Resolute was recovered by a salvage tug and limped back into dock 4 days later. He was in the medical pavilion when Marcus arrived, which was coincidental. He had been called there to deal with an access authorization problem and had stayed because the access authorization problem had turned out to be a symptom of something larger, and the larger thing was not good. The medical pavilion had never been designed for the volume of cases it was currently managing. The outer habitation ring shutdowns had displaced a significant portion of the spire's population inward, and the combination of cold, poor air quality, reduced food supply, and the general physical toll of a population under extended stress had produced an injury and illness rate that exceeded the facility's design parameters by a factor that Roland's medical liaison had described as significant, and that Roland, reading the actual numbers, privately reclassified as severe. The problem was the autodock units. The Spire had 47 of them, distributed across the medical pavilion and its satellite treatment stations. They were sophisticated machines capable of complex surgical procedures, capable of administering pharmaceutical protocols at a precision that exceeded human capacity, capable of stabilizing patients that would have died in previous centuries. They were also locked. The physician who had called Roland was named David Soren, who was a neural specialist by training and who was currently operating in conditions that bore no resemblance to his training, because conditions that resembled his training no longer existed in the Spire's medical system. The units are running a triage algorithm, Soren said. He looked like someone who had not slept in a long time and had also recently been crying, though Roland suspected he would deny the latter. Standard mass casualty protocol. They assess survival probability and allocate treatment resources accordingly. Patients below a certain probability threshold are classified as palliative comfort measures only. No surgical intervention. No pharmaceutical allocation beyond pain management minimums. That's standard, Roland said. Soren grabbed his arm. The threshold is set at 18%. Anyone the system assesses at below 18% survival probability doesn't receive treatment, just observation. And the system's assessment methodology is based on vital signs and injury classification, without the contextual adjustments that a human clinician would make based on judgment, on knowing that the algorithm is wrong. on deciding that 18% is a number and not a sentence. He pointed at one of the units. Through the frosted panel, the occupant was visible only as a shape. The readout above the panel showed a survival probability of 11% and a status indicator that read palliative protocol active. The human nurses used to override it, Soren said. They would input manual corrections to the vital signs assessment. They would inflate the numbers just enough to push the patient over threshold, trick the machine into initiating treatment, and then he stopped, pressed his mouth into a thin line. They would hold the patient while the autodoc caught up, manually, physically. They would hold ruptured tissue together while the machine ran its procedures because the machine needed the patient to be stable first, and the patient needed the machine to act first, and someone had to bridge that gap. Roland stared at the unit. The root directory for the triage algorithm is locked, Soren said. Biometric authentication. We tried your ministerial override. We tried the High Chancellor's code. The system returned the same error both times. Roland closed his eyes briefly. He already knew the answer. He asked anyway. Whose credentials does it require? Sarah Voss, Soren said. 2 years ago she audited our pharmaceutical allocation logs. The council accused the human medical staff of overdispensing. She locked the root directory to her own biometric signature to create an accountability record. Every change to the protocol would require her physical authentication. She was trying to prove that every dose dispensed was necessary. Roland opened his eyes and looked at the unit again. The percentage readout, the flat, clean efficiency of a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do. She gave us the oversight we demanded, Roland said. The patient behind the frosted panel had stopped moving. Soren didn't speak for a moment. His hands were hanging at his sides. I don't know how to lie to the machine, he said quietly. I don't know how to trick it into doing what it should be doing anyway. I look at the number and I just accept the number. I don't know how to not accept the number. Roland pulled the data spike from his pocket. He plugged it into the unit's interface port. The screen went from amber to a hard red. The error message was 5 words. Human biometric authentication required. He stood there looking at those 5 words for a long time. Then he put the data spike back in his pocket and walked out of the pavilion, back into the dripping, cold corridors of a station that was failing one system at a time. And the systems were failing in the specific order that revealed, with increasing clarity, everything they had never bothered to understand about who had been keeping the lights on. Marcus returned from the Vela boundary with a broken shoulder and the specific look of a man who has tested something that he knew might not work and has found that it does not work. He did not ask about the probe. He did not ask about the needle. He walked off the recovery team's gantry and looked at Roland and then walked toward the assembly chambers. And Roland followed him. And neither of them needed to discuss where they were going or why. The spire was dying. There was no longer much point in discussing whether that was true. The audio file was found by accident. Roland had sent 2 of his remaining technical staff into the sub-basement of the human embassy compound, not the main building, which had been secured and sealed by the Compact's Property Administration Unit pending a formal vacancy review, but the secondary infrastructure hub that sat underneath it, accessible through a maintenance corridor in Sector 4 that most of the spire's residents didn't know existed. He had sent them there to investigate a power draw anomaly. The spire's grid was fragile now, shedding load in unpredictable ways as the automated distribution systems ran without human oversight, and every unexplained drain was a potential cascade point. His staff were supposed to identify the source and either resolve it or flag it for manual intervention. What they found: buried 4 directories deep in an auxiliary power management node that should have contained nothing but voltage regulation logs, was a file set to trigger on a specific condition: manual rerouting of power to the embassy's communications array. Someone had tried to reroute that power the previous week, hoping to restore a secondary broadcast channel, and the attempt had woken the file up. It was an audio recording, 43 minutes long, tagged with a timestamp from the night the humans left. Roland listened to the first 30 seconds alone, in his office, with the door closed. Then he stopped the playback, sat still for approximately 2 minutes, and sent an all-delegate notification for an emergency session of the full assembly. The chamber was not full. It had not been full for several sessions. The outer ring evacuations had displaced some delegates. Others had returned to their home systems, citing communication difficulties and the need to manage local crises directly, which Roland translated in his own private assessment as they are leaving while they can still leave. But there were enough delegates present for what needed to happen, and more had come than he expected. which told him that the notification had reached people who were still paying attention. Marcus stood at the podium. He looked better than he had in the immediate aftermath of the Resolute's recovery. The shoulder had been treated. The sleep deprivation was slightly reduced. The particular hollow quality around his eyes had not improved but had stabilized. He looked like a man who had passed through the worst of something and come out the other side into a different kind of bad, which Roland supposed was technically progress. "We have recovered a message," Marcus said, "from the embassy's auxiliary systems, left for us by Ambassador Hall on the night of the departure." The chamber was already quiet. It got quieter. Roland pressed the key. The silence that preceded the audio was not empty. It had the specific acoustic texture of a recording made in a large room by someone sitting close to the microphone room tone. The human sound technicians had called it. That layer of ambient air that told you where a person was when they spoke. This room tone carried the sound of an empty space, a big one, and then Edmund Hall sighed. And the sigh was the sound of a man sitting alone in an office that used to be full of people, and it filled the chamber like water filling a vessel. "If you're hearing this," Edmund's voice said, "it means you finally went looking in the basement." A small sound moved through the chamber. Not quite a laugh. More like recognition, the specific discomfort of understanding a reference about yourself. "I told Sarah to clean everything out," Edmund continued. "She did a thorough job. She always does a thorough job. But I couldn't quite bring myself to leave without, well, think of it as a note on the kitchen table." The chair in the recording shifted. The sound of fabric. The unhurried movement of someone who was not in a rush because all the decisions had already been made. "I expect Cornelius is furious. Marcus, I imagine, is pulling apart supply chain data trying to find the lever. Neither of you are wrong to do those things. Those are the things you do. I understand that. I understood it for 30 years. A pause. When we arrived at the Spire, when humanity first joined the Compact. Before my time. Before most people's time, we were genuinely excited. I know that sounds naive from where I'm standing now, but we were. We looked at this assembly, at the idea of it, at all of these different peoples sitting down at one table and trying to build something together. And we thought, this is worth doing. We are small and new, and we don't know the rules yet, but we will learn them. We will be useful. We will prove ourselves." Roland looked at his console. His hands were completely still, which was unusual for him. He was someone who processed things by moving his hands. "So we built," Edmund said. "We built what needed building because someone had to, and we were there. We ran the logistics because the systems needed running. We held the border because the border needed holding. We fixed the infrastructure because the infrastructure was broken, and we were the ones who knew how to fix it. We did all of this, and we thought we kept thinking that at some point the table would get a little wider, that at some point someone would say, 'These people have been here 30 years, and they've been doing the work. Maybe they should have a say in how it's done.'" His voice didn't harden. That was what Roland noticed. It was not the voice of someone working up to anger. It was the voice of someone who was well past anger and was speaking from the place that comes after. "Every time I requested a seat on the High Council, I was told, in due time, Ambassador. Every time Sarah filed a budget request for infrastructure maintenance, she was told, discretionary, deferred. Every time Nathan lost people holding a border that wasn't technically ours to hold, he received a memo of commendation and a cut to hazard pay. We were useful, extremely useful, and the Compact was very grateful, and nothing changed. A sound in the recording glass touching a hard surface. The small, particular sound of someone setting something down. We're not leaving because we hate you. I want to be clear about that. I have known Marcus Vale for 15 years and I don't hate him. I think he is, in his way, a good man trying to do an impossible job. I think Cornelius is a man who genuinely believes he is holding civilization together and is not entirely wrong about that. I think most of the people in that chamber are doing what they were taught to do and don't know that they were taught wrong. But a civilization cannot ask a people to hold up its roof and also tell that people they don't have the standing to come inside. It cannot do that indefinitely and expect the people holding the roof to keep holding it. We were losing something. Coming here every cycle and being told in 100 different ways that we were necessary but not equal. We were losing something that we did not have enough of to keep losing. So we're going home. We're going to lock the door. We're going to grow our own food and fix our own roads and look at our own sky for a while. And we're going to see if we can remember what we were before we spent 30 years trying to earn a table we were never going to be invited to sit at. The recording ran through a few seconds of room tone. The galaxy is yours. Compact. You built it. Or you said you did. Now you have to run it. Don't come looking for us." A pause that had the quality of someone almost saying something else and deciding not to. "Good luck, Marcus," Edmund said. "Finally, I mean that without any irony. I truly hope you figure it out." The recording ended. The waveform on Roland's screen went flat. In the chamber, nobody spoke. Roland had expected something. Not shouting, but noise of some kind. The habitual response of a political body to a provocation. What he got instead was a specific stillness that he recognized from long experience. As the stillness of people confronting something they already knew and had been managing not to look at directly. The Avon delegate, whose name was Civil and who represented a coalition of worlds in the outer arm, was the first to break it. He stood up, his feathers broad, iridescent, usually carried at a particular angle that communicated measured authority, were flat against his body, which was the Avon equivalent of a human sitting with their shoulders dropped and their hands in their lap. "High Chancellor," Civil said, "the Avon worlds wish to formally note that this message does not constitute grounds for renegotiating the departure's legality. The compact accords are binding. The human delegation's withdrawal is in violation of. There is no mechanism for enforcing treaty violations against a party that has physically removed themselves from our jurisdiction and sealed the access point," Roland said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The acoustics in the chamber were worse than they used to be. The calibration was drifting, but his voice still carried. "You could draft an enforcement motion. I would be curious to know who you intend to serve it to." Civil sat down. His feathers didn't change position. Nobody else immediately stood. The delegates looked at each other, or at the floor, or at the empty arc of seats in the human section, which had been stripped for nearly a month now and still managed to be the most present thing in the room. Then Grayson Aldeck stood up. Grayson represented the Seth Concord, a sprawling coalition of heavy industrial worlds in the outer rim that ran their economies on ore processing, shipbuilding, and freight. He was not someone who made theatrical speeches. He was someone who brought physical paper documents to assembly sessions, because he had grown up in a system where the power went out frequently and had never fully trusted anything that required a working grid. He was holding a sheaf of those documents now. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Roland. He looked at Edmund's empty desk. "High Chancellor," Grayson said. His voice was the voice of a large man trying to speak carefully. "The Seth Concord formally withdraws from the Galactic Compact. 3 weeks earlier, that sentence would have caused an uproar. Accusations of treason, threats of economic sanctions. Roland would have been on his feet before Grayson finished the second word, running the immediate retaliatory calculus. Marcus would have called for order. The chamber would have taken an hour to calm down. What it produced now was silence, the same quality of silence as the end of the recording. The silence of a room that has already absorbed so much that one more thing fits inside it without disrupting anything. "You are breaking a 300-year alliance," Marcus said. He said it evenly, not a threat, just a fact, offered carefully, in case Grayson had not fully accounted for it. "The alliance is already broken," Grayson said. "Our trade routes to the core are closed. The navigation beacons along the main corridor are down, and we don't have the personnel to restore them. Our orbital docks have had 4 automated freight system failures in the past week, and 2 of those failures resulted in direct damage to docked vessels. Our food import schedule is running at 30% of baseline because the haulers can't make the transit safely. My people are not living under the protection of the Compact, Marcus. They are managing the consequences of the Compact's collapse. We need to consolidate our resources on our home systems while we still have resources to consolidate." Roland looked at the structural integrity data on his secondary monitor. The outer ring evacuations had reduced the station load, as planned. The reduction had bought them approximately 11 additional days before the power grid reached its next critical threshold. 11 days was what managing the consequences looked like from his desk. "If the Seth Concord withdraws its fleet components," Roland said, "the Morian pirates will have an uncontested corridor into your inner systems within perhaps," Grayson said. He set his papers in front of him. He set them down gently, not with emphasis, just with the finality of someone putting something down that they've been carrying for a while. "But at least we will be making that choice ourselves, in our own territory, with whatever we have left." He turned and walked toward the exit. His delegation, 11 delegates in total, stood and followed him. The chamber doors opened manually. The automated mechanism had failed 2 days ago, and the workaround was a wall-mounted hand crank and closed with a sound that was too heavy for the space. a deep mechanical clang that sat in the room after it happened. Marcus stood at the podium. He looked at the closed doors for a moment. Then he looked at the Avon section, where Civil was sitting motionless, and at the delegates from the deep core systems, and at the representatives of the Aran coalition. He looked at all of them, and they looked at him. And Roland watched the assessment happen in real time, watched each delegate calculate what the Seth departure meant for their own position, for their own access to the compact's remaining functional systems, for their own political survival. Civil stood up next. He spoke quietly. "The worlds of the outer arm," he said. "The agricultural systems in the Sector 9 cluster, we cannot sustain the core supply schedule without the irrigation calibration systems running at full capacity. Those systems require maintenance inputs that our engineering teams cannot provide. We are manually redirecting water on 16 worlds. People are dying from contaminated secondary sources. We have to pull back." Marcus said nothing. "Who else?" Roland said. He heard his own voice as though it belonged to someone else. He wasn't asking it as a challenge. He was asking it as a logistics question. Who else needed to be accounted for in the restructure? Who else, it turned out, was most of the chamber? Not in a rush. Not dramatically. One delegation and then another and then a third. Each one standing and offering a brief, exhausted explanation that contained some variation of the same essential logic. The systems they depended on were failing, and the compact could not repair them, and they needed to concentrate on what they could actually manage. An elderly delegate from the Deep Core Coalition, a woman named Preve, who Roland had known for 2 decades, stopped beside him on her way out. She was using a cane that she hadn't needed 6 months ago. "We let this happen," she said. She wasn't accusing him. She was observing. She had the tone of someone observing something they had observed before and recognized and still found it impossible to do anything useful about. "We spent 50 years letting them carry the weight, and we forgot how to lift. You don't rebuild a foundation while the roof is coming down. Roland, you just get clear of the walls." She walked out. Within 30 minutes, the chamber had lost 2/3 of its delegates. What remained was a small cluster of core system representatives too geographically bound to the spire to realistically depart, and Roland, and Marcus. Marcus stood at the podium and looked at the empty seats. He did not look at the podium or at the assembly's formal seal mounted on the wall behind him, which was ornate and old and had been maintained to a high standard of preservation by the compact's cultural heritage staff, all of whom were human, none of whom were here, and which was consequently starting to tarnish at the edges. He looked at the empty seats in the human section. "Edmund told me something," Marcus said. He wasn't speaking to Roland specifically. He wasn't speaking to the chamber. He was speaking in the way people speak when they're no longer performing the act of communication, but simply saying something that needs to be said. "During the Orion Trade Corridor negotiations, he came to my office. He wanted human infrastructure engineers to have full clearance access to the Spire's core systems, the primary grid, the atmospheric management hub, the structural monitoring network." Roland listened. "I told him no. I told him it was a security vulnerability. You don't give the keys to the core systems to people who aren't on the High Council." Those were my words. People who aren't on the High Council. He looked at the podium surface. Edmund didn't argue. He had argued before, plenty of times. And he was apparently done arguing. He just looked at me for a while, and then he said, "Marcus, the person who builds the plumbing already owns the house. You just live there." Marcus looked up. His eyes moved across the empty seats, the stripped desks of the human section, the tarnishing seal. "I thought he was being dramatic," Marcus said. "I thought it was a negotiating posture." He paused. He was trying to help me understand something that I didn't want to understand, because understanding it would have required me to change something. And changing it would have required me to admit I was wrong. And I was the High Chancellor of the Interstellar Compact, and I didn't. He stopped. Roland said nothing. "We thought they were our infrastructure," Marcus said. "The thing you build on top of, not the people who put it there." He stepped down from the podium. He did not look back at the seal. He walked toward the exit, and at the door he paused with his hand on the crank mechanism and said, "Turn the lights off when you leave. Roland, let's not run the batteries down any faster than we have to." The door opened with effort and closed with that same heavy clang. Roland sat at his station for a while after that. The chamber held 31 delegates, all of them quiet, all of them looking at their data pads, or at the floor, or at nothing in particular. The holographic display in the center of the room was dark. The projector system had lost power 2 days ago, and nobody had yet worked out how to restore it on manual backup. The ambient lighting was running at reduced capacity. which gave the space a dim, flat quality that was not quite darkness but was far from the clean, bright bioluminescence it had been designed to provide. Roland looked at his logistics screen, the aggregate failure metric he had labeled, in a private moment of grim humor. Total systemic failure percentage was at 67. He had not updated the label since he made it, even though the humor had gone out of it some time ago. He looked at Edmund's empty desk. He thought about what it would have cost to widen the table. Not financially, he had the budget figures, the trade concession calculations, the political cost analysis. He had run those numbers more than once over the years. When Edmund had made his formal requests and Marcus had asked Roland for an assessment of what accommodation might look like, the numbers had never been prohibitive. The cost had never been the actual obstacle. The obstacle had been simpler than that, more embarrassing than that. The obstacle had been the assumption, held by every senior member of the High Council for 30 years, that the people doing the work were doing it because that was their station, that they were content in the function they provided, that the function was so ingrained, so established, so reliably performed that it could not be otherwise, that the maintenance crews and the traffic controllers and the navigation beacon technicians and the border patrol and the logistics analysts and the medical staff and the agricultural coordinators and all the rest of them would simply keep doing what they did because that was the shape of the universe, that they did not, on some level, have the option of being anything else. Nobody had ever considered what would happen if they just stopped. Not because stopping seemed impossible, Roland thought, but because nobody had thought about them enough to imagine they might want to. He reached over and began manually switching off the lighting strips in the empty sections of the chamber, one bank at a time, conserving what was left. The human section he turned off last. He stood there for a moment in the partial dark, looking at where they had been. Then he turned off his own station, gathered his printouts under his arm, and walked out into the cold corridor, past the frost forming in the joints of the vaulted ceiling, back toward what remained. Frost does not announce itself. Roland had grown up on a station in the outer belt of his home system, a manufacturing platform that ran cold in the winter cycle and colder in the maintenance shutdowns. And he knew the specific way cold moved into a built space not as an event but as a process. Slow and incremental and easy to ignore until the point at which ignoring it was no longer an option. The Spire had always been climate-controlled to a precision that made the concept of seasonal variation irrelevant. You did not think about temperature in a station where temperature was managed as a matter of infrastructure, the same way you did not think about gravity or air. He began thinking about temperature approximately 9 weeks after the departure. It started as a draft, a specific coolness in the corridor outside his office that had not been there before, originating from a ventilation register that was pulling in air from the outer hull rather than the conditioned interior loop. He filed a maintenance request. The maintenance system logged it. Nobody came, because the HVAC routing team that would ordinarily have responded was 3 people, 2 of whom had been human and 1 of whom had since transferred to the skeleton crew, managing the outer habitation ring shutdown. The draft continued. The temperature in his office dropped 2 degrees over the following week and then held, because the remaining climate management systems were still partially functional, and the overall effect was a kind of thermal negotiation between the working components and the failing ones, in which the working components were gradually losing ground. By the 12th week, the negotiation was over. He could see his breath in the High Council antechamber, which was where he had moved his operation 3 weeks prior, when his office's secondary heating element had finally given out, and he had discovered, by process of elimination, that the antechamber had a manual heat source, a ventilation shaft running along the eastern wall that connected to the Spire's deep core and still carried residual warmth from the reactor systems. Not much warmth. Enough. The antechamber had not been designed as a living space. It had been designed as the staging area for High Council sessions, a grand, high-ceilinged room with polished dark floors and walls inlaid with the formal seals of the Compact's founding member systems. It was impressive in the way that spaces intended to impress always were, and it was also approximately 6 times larger than necessary for the purposes Roland was currently using it for, which meant it retained cold in the way that large spaces retain cold, thoroughly and without apology. He had moved 2 cots in, one for himself, one for Marcus. Marcus had not argued about the cots, which told Roland more about Marcus's current condition than anything Marcus had said directly. Marcus was not someone who accepted practical concessions without discussion. He had the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions for other people and found it difficult to stop making them even when the decisions were about his own comfort. The fact that he had looked at the cot and simply sat down on it and pulled the emergency foil blanket around his shoulders without comment told Roland that the stubbornness had gone somewhere it couldn't currently reach. The shoulder was not the main problem. The shoulder had been treated adequately, all things considered, and had healed to a functional if imperfect state. The main problem was what Roland privately thought of as the accumulated weight of everything: the weeks of inadequate sleep, the inadequate food, the specific psychological burden of being responsible for something that was failing too fast to save and too important to abandon. Marcus had been carrying that weight since the departure, and it had not lightened, and the cold had settled into it in the way that cold settles into joints that are already under stress, making the existing damage worse without being, technically, the cause. He was sleeping more than he used to. Roland noted this without commenting on it. He kept the fire going. The fire was Roland's own practical invention, born of necessity and a complete absence of better options. The Spire's treaty archives, paper copies of 12 decades of diplomatic agreements, maintained in physical form as a heritage requirement of the Compact's founding charter, were stored in fireproof cabinets in the antechamber's north alcove. The cabinets were fireproof. The documents inside them were not. Roland had assessed this situation with the pragmatic clarity of a man who had nothing left to be sentimental about and had begun, carefully and systematically, feeding the documents into a small chemical waste bin that he had converted into a contained heat source. He was burning the Compact's history to stay warm. He had considered, briefly, whether this was appropriate, and had concluded that the Compact's history was no longer performing any function and that warmth was. He was feeding a trade agreement from the early consolidation period into the flames paper, going quickly, the treaty language dissolving into ash in a matter of seconds when Marcus spoke for the first time in 2 days. I dreamed about Edmund. Roland did not look up immediately. He waited a moment, in case Marcus was still half asleep and would not remember having spoken. He was sitting in my office, Marcus said. His voice had the specific quality it got when he was very tired, lower than usual, stripped of its public register, sounding like the voice of the man underneath the High Chancellor rather than the High Chancellor himself. He was drinking coffee, that terrible black coffee he always had, the kind that smelled like it was doing something structural. Roland set down the treaty and looked at him. Marcus was lying on the cot with one arm across his chest and his eyes fixed on the ceiling. His face in the dim amber of the emergency lighting looked older than his actual age, which had not been young to begin with. He had a requisition form, Marcus said. He wanted me to approve the budget for a new atmospheric scrubber in the Sector 4 filtration hub. The old one had been running at reduced capacity for 8 months. I saw that in the dream. Somehow I just knew it. 8 months. He came to me with the form and I told him no. I told him we were allocating 3 trillion credits to the Monument Commission and I couldn't justify the filtration equipment at that budget point. He was quiet for a moment. That was real, Marcus said. It actually happened. Not exactly like that. The monument was the second-generation memorial, the one commissioned for the Founding Accord's centennial, but the conversation was real. He came to me with a maintenance request, and I told him we couldn't afford it. And then Sarah Voss figured out a software workaround and filed it under routine infrastructure updates, and I never saw it in my reports again. And I thought that meant the problem had been resolved. Roland looked at the fire. The problem was resolved, Roland said. I know. Marcus closed his eyes. That's what I can't stop thinking about. She fixed it. She fixed it with nothing, with their own time and their own knowledge, because I wouldn't give her the budget to fix it properly. And then she filed it so neatly that I never had to know she'd done it. And I thought that was just how things worked. Things broke, and then they got fixed, and I was doing other things, and the system was functioning, and everybody was fine. He didn't speak for a while. Roland fed another page into the fire. The seal of the Orion Trade Compact. Second revision. Curled and blackened and was gone. We built a paradise, Marcus said. Or we said we did. We told ourselves we had built something remarkable, the greatest political achievement in the history of the known galaxy. And we believed it. We believed it fully. And we never once thought seriously about who was keeping it running. Not as a matter of gratitude or recognition. I mean, we never thought about it at all. They were infrastructure, like the power grid, like the life support. You don't think about life support until it fails. His breathing had a quality to it that Roland had been trying not to analyze for the past several days. A slight unevenness, a faint resistance on the inhale that had not been there a week ago. The cold had settled. "You should sleep," Roland said. "I know." Marcus didn't open his eyes. "There's nothing useful I can do that you aren't already doing. And sleeping is the only way to be warm without burning treaties." So the closest thing to a joke Marcus had made in 3 weeks. Roland noted it and said nothing. Outside the antechamber, the spire continued its slow and comprehensive decline. Roland tracked it the way he tracked everything systematically. In the private ledger he maintained on a salvage datapad, running on a manual battery he recharged each morning by hand crank. Because the spire's network was no longer reliable enough to trust with records he might actually need. The power grid had reached its critical threshold on schedule, which was to say ahead of the schedule he had given Marcus and behind the schedule he had given himself. The primary reactor was in protective shutdown, having triggered its final safety protocol to prevent a catastrophic cascade. They were running on auxiliary batteries. The batteries were discharging at a rate that he could calculate precisely and wished he couldn't. The outer habitation rings were dark and sealed. The commercial sectors of the inner tiers were dark and mostly empty, occupied in patches by people who had nowhere else to go and were managing on chemical heat sources and ration supplies from the automated food stores, which were themselves running low and had begun dispensing at reduced allocations 3 weeks ago. The medical pavilion was operating on a manual triage system that Davin Soren had developed after the Autodoc crisis, a paper-based assessment protocol, handwritten, using whatever pharmaceutical supplies remained unlocked by the human biometric system. Davin had told Roland, in a communication that was difficult to receive clearly because the internal comms were degrading, that they were losing people they could have saved 6 months ago, and saving people they wouldn't have been able to save with the old system, and that he wasn't sure how to calculate what that meant in terms of net outcome. Roland had not tried to calculate it. Some numbers he had decided to stop running. The scavengers started appearing in the 6th week after the outer rings closed. They came in small ships through the outer docking ports, which the automated systems could no longer adequately monitor and which Roland lacked the personnel to physically patrol. They were not violent. As far as Roland could determine, they were opportunists, picking through the abandoned sections of the spire for anything with resale value, copper wiring from the walls, memory drive components from decommissioned server racks, the structural alloy fittings from pressurized door frames. They stripped the upper commercial galleries of anything that wasn't bolted down and several things that were. Roland encountered one of them once. In a corridor near the secondary archives, a young person in a patched vacuum suit carrying a bag of salvaged data cores. They looked at each other. Roland asked, in the most direct way he could manage, that they not take anything from the lower antechamber section. The person nodded, adjusted the bag on their shoulder, and left. He didn't try to stop the scavenging after that. The things being taken were things the spire no longer needed, and the people taking them clearly did, and his allocation of energy was better spent elsewhere. He had become, over these weeks, extremely precise about the allocation of his energy. There was not enough of it to spend on things that didn't matter, and the category of things that mattered had contracted significantly. What mattered? The fire, the food supply calculation, Marcus's breathing. On a Tuesday he was still tracking days, still winding the small analog clock he had found in a supply cabinet and whose steady ticking had become the most reliable sound in his environment. Marcus's breathing was noticeably worse. Roland had been listening to it for several days with the particular attention of someone who knows what they are listening for and does not want to be right. He had been right before about things he didn't want to be right about, and the experience had not improved his tolerance for it. He made tea, actual tea, from the last of a supply he had found sealed in the embassy's secondary kitchen, and brought it to Marcus's cot and sat with him for a while. Marcus held the cup in both hands. The warmth, Roland thought, was probably more useful than the tea itself. When they go dark, Marcus said, they go dark. He was looking at the emergency lighting strips along the baseboard, which were running at a fraction of their intended output and throwing the room into deep amber shadow. I have been thinking about what it actually looks like when a civilization ends. He paused. I thought it looked like something dramatic, a war, a catastrophe, an event you could point to and say, there, that is the moment. But it doesn't, does it? No, Roland said. It looks like this. It looks like the lights getting dimmer a little at a time, and people leaving because there's nothing left to stay for. And one day you notice the room is very quiet and you've stopped expecting it to be otherwise. He turned the cup in his hands. There's a particular kind of grief in that. Not the sharp kind. The kind that settles in. Roland looked at the fire. There were not many documents left in the north alcove. He had been rationing them, taking only what he needed for each session of burning and leaving the rest. It was an act of pacing that had no practical outcome when the documents ran out. They ran out, but he found it easier to do the thing in front of him rather than think about the arithmetic of what came after. You should go to the embassy sector, Marcus said. Roland looked at him. When things get worse, go to the lower ward, to the human section. Cornelius said this to me once, years ago, when we were discussing the compact's emergency preparedness protocols. He said, whatever else you do, don't let the human infrastructure fall below maintenance priority. He said it like a joke. I think I laughed. Marcus looked at the ceiling, but he was right. He was right about everything they built. The walls are thicker. The systems are manual where ours are automated. They over-engineered everything because they knew they were working with budget that got cut every cycle, and they couldn't afford to have things break. I know, Roland said. I know you know. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I just wanted to say it directly, in case I don't have another good opportunity. Roland sat with that for a moment. Stop, he said. No. Marcus's voice was not argumentative. It was simply steady. I need to say the useful things while I'm still clear enough to say them. And the useful thing right now is, go to the embassy. It will be the last part of this station that holds together. And I would rather you were in it than up here with me being noble about. He stopped. His chest moved with the particular labor of breath that has become effort rather than reflex. We were caretakers of something we didn't understand, Marcus said. We thought we were the custodians of civilization. Turned out we were guests in a house someone else was maintaining. And we treated the maintenance staff like furniture. He closed his eyes. That's not a complicated lesson. It shouldn't have taken this long to learn it. His voice had gone quieter. Roland leaned forward slightly. Edmund warned me, Marcus said, multiple times. Not just the plumbing comment that was one instance of a pattern. He warned me in the Orion negotiations. He warned me in the border hazard pay dispute. He warned me in writing. Formally, twice in the decade before he left. In documents I received and acknowledged and did not act on because acting on them would have meant admitting something I wasn't prepared to admit. He exhaled, slowly. I'm sorry, he said. He was not talking to Roland. The fire popped softly in the waste bin. The analog clock ticked. A long time passed and Marcus did not say anything else. Roland sat there for a while after the breathing stopped. He did not check for a pulse. He had worked alongside Marcus Vale for 22 years, and he knew what it sounded like when the room had changed. And the room had changed. He sat in the amber-lit silence with the last of the fire burning down to coals. And outside the antechamber, the spire groaned in its slow structural way, the sound of a massive thing cooling, metal contracting against metal. The inorganic expression of a building that has been kept warm for a century by systems that are now failing. The emergency strips along the baseboard pulsed once, twice, and dropped to a lower setting, finding whatever reserve remained in the battery banks. Roland reached over and covered Marcus with the foil blanket. He straightened it at the edges, which was not useful and was also the only thing he could do. So he did it carefully. Then he gathered what he had: the data pad, the hand crank, the clock, the remaining food from the locked cabinet in the antechamber storage alcove, and he walked out into the corridor. The darkness was almost total except for the floor strips, which threw everything into low amber relief and made the shadows of the corridor pillars long and strange on the walls. He had been this way before. He knew the route to the lower ward. He had walked it enough times in the past 3 months to know it without the lights. He walked until the corridor changed. The material changed, not the dramatic observable difference of a renovation, but the subtle, structural change of walls that had been built to a different specification. Thicker, heavier. The cold was still present, but differently present. The way cold feels when it has been slowed rather than stopped. When Roland pressed his palm against the wall of the embassy corridor, the surface was cold, but not the biting cold of exposed station infrastructure. It was the cold of something that had been built with insulation in mind, with physical fiberglass packed into the cavity behind the panel rather than an energy field requiring power to maintain. The door to the embassy compound was sealed. Roland had the access code. He had extracted it weeks ago from the property administration records on the grounds that he might need it, and the lock was mechanical, not networked, which meant the code still worked regardless of what the Spire systems were doing. He stepped inside. It smelled different in here. Not good exactly, but less bad than the rest of the station. The air was stale, but not the stale of failing scrubbers. The stale of a sealed space that had been clean when it was sealed. He stood in the entrance corridor for a moment and let his eyes adjust and let the slightly warmer air settle against his skin. And then he walked further in. He found the generator in the basement. It was exactly what Marcus had described. A kinetic generator. Manual. Crank. Utilitarian in the way that everything in this section was utilitarian, built to work rather than to be impressive. Built for the maintenance tunnel rather than the gallery. He cranked it for 20 minutes. Enough to charge the salvaged battery he'd brought with him to operational capacity, and then connected it to the space heater he'd found in a supply closet, and sat in the small warmth it produced and did not think about the antechamber. Not yet. There was time for that. There was, it seemed, a great deal of time ahead that would be his alone to fill. He picked up the analog clock. It had stopped during the transit. He had not been winding it, and he wound it now, carefully, feeling the spring tighten under his fingers until the resistance told him it was fully coiled. Then he set it on the floor beside the heater and listened to it begin to tick. Steady, mechanical, entirely indifferent to the state of everything around it. The coiled spring did not require a power grid. It did not require network access or biometric authentication or a software protocol that somebody had forgotten to document. It required only the periodic attention of someone willing to wind it, and Roland was willing to wind it. And so it ticked. He sat and listened to it tick for a long time. Outside, somewhere above him, the spire continued to go dark. Time does strange things when you stop having reasons to track it carefully. Roland had always been a man of precise measurement. His professional life had been organized around the reliable quantification of things' tonnage, transit duration, budget cycles, failure rates, and the assumption that knowing the exact number was always preferable to approximating it. He had kept logs. He had maintained records. He had been the kind of person who noted the time when he woke up not because it was necessary, but because the habit of precision was, in his experience, the thing that separated functional systems from failing ones. The chronometers failed in the 3rd month after Marcus died. The spire's internal network was gone by then, and the few remaining devices that had been running on local battery were running out of local battery. And one morning, Roland reached for the data pad he used to track the days and found that it had gone dark overnight and would not come back on regardless of how long he held the power contact. He sat with it in his hands for a while. Then he set it aside and picked up the analog clock and wound it and listened to it tick and decided that ticking was enough. That ticking was, in fact, more than enough. It was the only sound in his environment that had no implication of failure, no suggestion of a system approaching its limit. The spring wound and the gears turned, and the second hand moved with complete mechanical indifference to everything that was happening around it. And Roland found, to his own mild surprise, that this was a form of comfort. He stopped counting days. He counted windings instead, each morning or what he decided was morning, based on a rough circadian intuition that became less rough as the months accumulated and his body settled into its own rhythm, independent of artificial light cycles. He wound the clock. The clock ticked. He cranked the generator for however long his arms would sustain it, charged the battery, rationed the heat, ate whatever was available from the stores he had located in the embassy's secondary kitchen and the sealed supply cache in the basement maintenance corridor. He moved methodically through the tasks of staying alive, and the days passed, or the windings passed, and the spire continued its slow cooling process around him, and Roland continued to be present inside it. He had not expected to survive this long. Not in a dramatic sense. He had not been counting down toward an end, had not been lying on the cot in the embassy's back office, calculating how many ration packs remained and measuring the distance between that number and his expected natural lifespan. He had simply not thought much about it. The present had been so consistently demanding of his attention that the future had become a kind of theoretical space he visited rarely and briefly. Each day had its requirements. He met them. The next day had different requirements. He met those too. This was, he understood, probably how the human maintenance crews had experienced their work for 30 years. The relentless, specific, unglamorous present. The thing that needs doing right now. Not the abstract significance of the thing you're doing. He had spent 3 decades looking at supply chain data that represented the work those crews did without ever seriously imagining what the work felt like from inside it. He was imagining it now, with considerable clarity. The embassy was, as Marcus had predicted with his last useful breath, the most durable structure on the station. Roland had spent enough time in it now to understand the engineering in a way he hadn't when he first arrived. It was not elegant. The walls were thick in a way that was visually unremarkable. You wouldn't walk through and think, "This is beautiful." The way you might walking through the High Council's crystalline galleries. You would walk through and think, "This is solid." This is a space that was built by people who expected to need it for a long time and planned accordingly. The insulation was physical rather than energy dependent. The load-bearing elements were overspecified for the station's standard structural requirements, which had struck the original compact engineering reviewers as excessive and had been noted in a formal assessment as redundant. The redundancy was, Roland now understood, the point. You build redundancy into something when you know that no one is going to come fix it on a reliable schedule. You build redundancy because you know that the budget for replacement parts is going to get cut, and the maintenance window is going to get pushed back, and the system still needs to be standing when all of that has happened. He had found the formal assessment in the embassy's physical filing system, in a cabinet near the secondary entrance. The compact engineering reviewer's summary was 3 pages long and concluded with a recommendation that the construction specifications be revised downward to align with station standards, which would have reduced the material cost by approximately 17%. The recommendation had a handwritten response in the margin, in the specific ink color that Sarah Voss used for all of her annotations. He recognized it because he had seen her annotations on hundreds of documents over the years, always in that particular dark blue. The response said, "Denied. We know what we're building for." Roland had read it several times. He had put it back in the cabinet and closed the cabinet and gone to wind the clock. And when he came back the next morning, the cabinet was still there and the annotation was still in it, and the wall around him was still standing. And he thought about it without being able to add anything to what Sarah had already said about it, which was everything. He had found Edmund's coat in the 4th month. It was hanging in a locker near the main airlock, the one Edmund had sealed on the night of the departure before walking to his shuttle. Roland had opened the locker looking for additional cold weather materials and had stood there for a long moment looking at the coat before taking it down. It was heavy wool, dark, worn at the elbows in the specific way that indicates a garment used for work rather than appearance. Too large for Roland by a noticeable margin. Edmund had been a broader man. He put it on anyway. It was warm in the way that things are warm when they were built to be warm rather than to look it. He wore it every day after that. He did not think of it as a symbolic act. He thought of it as a coat. The scavengers came occasionally. Less often as the months turned into what Roland estimated were years. There was a point at which the spire had been stripped of whatever was economically useful to strip, and the effort of docking outweighed the return, and the ships stopped coming. He was alone in a way that he could feel physically, the way you feel the absence of sound in a room that used to have it. Not painful. Exactly. More like weather. A condition that was present and that he moved through rather than something that happened to him. He thought about things. He had not, in his professional life, been someone who spent large amounts of time in unstructured thought. His mind had always been occupied with the practical and the immediate. Now it was occupied with whatever it wanted to be occupied with, which turned out to be a fairly wide-ranging set of subjects approached without agenda or resolution. He thought about the compact and its history. He thought about the border campaigns and the navigation beacons and the atmospheric scrubbers and the filtration systems and the long, invisible lattice of human work that had held the known galaxy in a functioning shape for 50 years. He thought about Dave and Soren lying to the autodock units and holding patients together while the machine caught up. He thought about Gideon Rail sitting frozen in the navigation chair with blood drying on his face, saying they wove it into the fabric of the sector. He thought about Edmund Hall setting down a glass in an empty room and saying, "Good luck." "Marcus, I mean that without any irony," he thought, with the particular clarity that comes from having a great deal of time and very little else to do with it, about what the compact had been. Not what it had claimed to be the greatest political achievement in the known galaxy, the grand cooperative of 1,000 worlds, the shining proof that difference could be bridged by shared interest and mutual governance. What it had actually been, what its daily, functional reality had consisted of, and what he kept arriving at, from multiple angles and across many windings of the clock, was something so simple it embarrassed him. The compact had been a building, elaborate, old, full of history and ceremony and genuine achievement, and like any building, it had required maintenance, constant, unglamorous, skilled maintenance by people who understood its systems, and they had treated the maintenance workers like maintenance workers, and the maintenance workers had eventually walked out and locked the door on their way. And the building had begun to fall apart in exactly the way buildings fall apart when no one is tending them. That was it. The whole thing. Reduced. He was not sure whether understanding it completely, clearly, without any remaining capacity for self-deception, was useful. He suspected it was not useful in any practical sense, but it was honest. And honesty had become something he valued more as the windings accumulated, perhaps because it was one of the few things that cost nothing to maintain. On what he estimated was a morning in the second year or possibly the third. He had lost confidence in his year count and had stopped asserting it even to himself. He woke early and lay still for a while, listening to the clock, and then got up and cranked the generator and made the closest approximation to tea that remained possible with the supplies on hand, and drank it in Alfred's coat in the small warmth of the space heater, and felt something different in the texture of the day that he couldn't immediately identify. He picked up his lamp and walked. He had walked the embassy many times. He knew the corridors the way you know a space you have lived in, exclusively for a long time, not just the layout, but the specific quality of each section, which floors creaked and which didn't, where the cold was worst, where the light from the lamp bounced off the walls in a way that gave an impression of warmth, even when warmth was not present. He walked past the empty desks in the administrative section, past the server room stripped to its bare walls by Sarah Voss's methodical hands, past the small kitchen with its inventory he had long since memorized. He walked until he reached the ambassador's private office. The room was exactly as it had been when Roland first found it. Cold had a preserving quality, he had learned. The dust that should have settled on every surface over years of abandonment had barely accumulated. The air was too still, too dry, too cold for the normal process of settling. Edmund's desk was clean except for the one item Roland had placed on it himself in the first week after he arrived, and had maintained every day since. The analog clock. He had moved it here from the basement after the first month. The office felt like the right place for it. He couldn't have explained why precisely, except that it was Edmund's room, and the clock was the one thing in the station that still operated the way it was designed to operate. And that seemed like something Edmund would have appreciated. Roland wounded. He felt the spring tension build under his fingers, the familiar resistance. Then he set it down and listened to the tick establish itself, and sat down in Edmund's chair, and reached over to the heavy metal lever on the wall. The blast shield mechanism screamed. It always did. The gears were stressed, and the track was cold, and every time he operated it, he waited for the whole assembly to seize up and stay there. But the gears held human-machined, over-specified, redundant, and the blast shields over the primary window ground open, and starlight came into the room. It was different from the processed, filtered light the Spire had been designed to provide. No atmospheric dampeners, no ambient modulation to make it comfortable to look at, just stars, at their actual brightness, the way they looked from the vacuum beyond all of this. Roland sat it for a moment and let his eyes adjust. Then he looked toward the Vela system. The anomaly was still there. It had not changed, as far as he could tell, in the years since the departure. A sphere of perfect, total blackness. Exactly where the Vela system had been before the humans folded space-time around it and stepped inside and pulled the fold shut after them. It didn't reflect the starlight. It didn't occlude it in the way a solid object occluded it. It simply existed as an absence, a place where light went and didn't come back. Not because it was absorbed, but because the space it would have traveled through had been rearranged into something else. There was still a debris field around the outer docking area where Roland sat. Automated cargo ships that had made their final runs on pre-programmed routes long after the traffic control systems failed to stop them, arriving at dock coordinates that no longer corresponded to active berths, wandering through their approach vectors until fuel ran out or navigational error sent them into the station's structure. The debris had settled into a kind of permanent cloud, catching the starlight in irregular flashes. Roland had stopped seeing it as wreckage a long time ago. It was just the view. The specific view from the specific window, the one he came to most mornings now because there was no particular reason not to. He looked past the debris, past the drift and the cold and the slow structural ache of the dying station, and he looked at the Vela anomaly, and he thought about what was inside it. Billions of people, an entire civilization that had looked at the galaxy it occupied and calculated, with the kind of clarity that comes from sustained exhaustion rather than drama, that it was better off not being in it anymore. And then had done the thing that requires this most difficult kind of courage, not the courage of fighting back, not the courage of confrontation, but the courage of simply leaving, of deciding that the cost of staying was too high and the benefit of staying was too low, and that the people asking you to stay had never once seriously considered what it cost you to be there. Roland thought about what they were doing inside that bubble. Growing things, probably. Fixing roads. Teaching children the names of stars that were now, from inside the fold, arranged in a sky that looked slightly different from the one they'd grown up, seeing he didn't know if that was true. He didn't know enough about the physics of localized space-time folds to know what the sky looked like from inside one. But he liked the idea that it was slightly different, that they had, in some small specific way, their own sky now. He thought about Sarah Voss and her annotations in dark blue ink. He thought about Nathan Cross bringing his fleet home in the dark, transponders off, 11 years of border patrol behind him. He thought about Gideon Rail, who had known about the needle and had told them about the needle and had watched the needle close, and who was presumably somewhere on the outside of the fold with his pardon and his coffee and his stained flight jacket, doing whatever the post-Campac version of his life looked like. He thought about Edmund Hall in a wool coat, walking out of an airlock without looking back. You knew, Roland thought. Sitting in Edmund's chair in Edmund's coat with the starlight coming through the unfiltered window. You knew what would happen when you left. Not the specifics, you couldn't have known the exact sequence of failures, the precise cascade, but you knew the shape of it. You had been watching the shape of it for 30 years, from the inside. You had written it down, formally, twice, in documents that were acknowledged and filed and not acted on. You had said it out loud, in corridors and meeting rooms, and in a recording buried in a power management subsystem, in the specific patient way of someone who has explained something many times and knows they are explaining it once more for the record, rather than because they expect to be heard. And you left anyway, not out of cruelty. That was the thing Roland had needed the most time to understand, and had eventually understood so clearly it seemed obvious in retrospect. Edmund Hall had not locked that door to punish anyone. He had locked it because the door needed to be locked, because an open door between a dying system and a living one was a danger to the living one. And whatever else was true about Edmund Hall, he had always understood systems. He had understood them the way people understand things they have spent their entire adult lives maintaining, not theoretically, not from documentation, but in the specific, physical, intimate way of someone who has put their hands on the components and felt how they fit together and understood what happens when one of them fails. The compact had been failing for a long time. Edmund had known it. He had locked the door so that what was inside the fold had a chance of not failing with it. Roland pressed his palm against the cold glass. He could feel the specific cold of it through Edmund's glove, which he wore because his own gloves had worn through months ago. He held his hand against the glass for a moment, facing the direction of the anomaly, the direction of the absence, the direction of everything that had left and was not coming back. You built good walls, he said. His voice was rough. He used it infrequently enough now that it surprised him slightly when he did. He wasn't self-conscious about this. There was no one to be self-conscious for. He said what he wanted to say to the empty room and the star-filled window and the ticking clock on the desk behind him. You built everything well. That was the thing. In the end, that was the only thing. You built it well and you maintained what you built and you asked, reasonably and persistently and without ever quite losing your patience completely, for the basic acknowledgement that building and maintaining things well was a form of contribution that deserved to be taken seriously. And when the acknowledgement didn't come, after 30 years of it not coming, you went home. He sat back in the chair. The starlight fell across his hands, across the worn wool of the coat sleeves. He thought about what Marcus had said in those last days, about the house and the plumbing and the guests who had forgotten they were guests, about the monument to the founding accords that had cost 3 trillion credits while a water pump in Sector 4 went unrepaired for 8 months and a maintenance request was denied 4 times, and a software workaround was written in the margins of someone else's budget, and nobody who mattered ever knew it happened, because the people who wrote the workaround had long since learned not to expect anyone who mattered to pay attention. He thought about Preve, hobbling out of the chamber with her cane, saying we forgot how to carry our own weight. He thought about Grayson Aldeck setting his papers down gently on the desk and saying, at least we will die defending our own homes. He thought about the triage algorithm and the biometric lock in Davin Soren's hands and the 11% survival probability and the long flat tone from the auto-dock pod and Davin saying we don't know how to lie to the machines. Victor, we just read the screen. Roland. His name was Roland and he had known that. And he knew it now. And it was the same name it had always been. and Marcus had been the one who used it most, and Marcus was gone. And the clock on the desk ticked in the starlight, and the Vela anomaly sat in the dark of the outer system, a perfect closed circle, sealed from the inside. The last minister of the Interstellar Compact. He had no ledgers left to balance, no supply chain maps to update, no trade agreements to draft or tariff schedules to review or maintenance requests to approve or deny. The mathematics of the whole vast, complicated, failing enterprise had run its course, and the result was this room, and this light, and this coat, and the ticking of a wound spring in a cold office at the edge of what had once been the center of the known galaxy. He reached out and put his hand on the glass again. "Don't open it," he said quietly. Not to Edmund specifically. Not to any specific person or entity he thought might hear him. To the anomaly. If the anomaly was listening. To the idea of it. To whatever version of the conversation he was still capable of having with people who had been wise enough and exhausted enough to leave. Don't ever open it. He thought about the Monument Commission, the 3 trillion credits, the filing cabinet full of denied requests, the formal assessments recommending that the walls be built thinner, to reduce material cost by 17%. The dark blue ink in the margin saying we know what we're building for. We don't deserve the light, Roland said. The words came out without planning, which was how things came out now, simply and directly, without the intermediary of professional language or political framing, just the thing itself, said plainly into a room that wasn't going to argue with it. He sat back and put his hands in his lap and looked out the window at the stars and the anomaly and the debris catching light in its slow, irregular way. And he listened to the clock tick, and the cold settled into him in the gradual and patient way that cold settles into things that are no longer resisting it. And the starlight moved across the floor of the room as the station's slow orbital drift turned him by degrees toward the dark. He thought about tea. He thought about whether there was enough left for one more cup. He thought about the clock spring and how many windings it still had in it, and whether he would be there to wind it again tomorrow, and decided that this was not a calculation worth making. He thought about the blue sky inside the fold, the one he'd imagined and couldn't verify. Children who had grown up hearing about the compact, the way children hear about things that happened before they were born with the particular detachment of the past tense. The way you hear about a drought that ended before you were old enough to remember thirst. Children who looked at their own sky, their slightly different sky, and did not know or need to know what it had cost to have it. He thought that was good. He thought that was the right shape for it. The clock ticked. The stars moved. Roland sat in Edmund's coat in Edmund's chair with his palm against the cold glass, facing the direction of the people who had built his world. And he let the warmth of the space heater in the next room carry as far as it could carry. And he listened to the mechanism that didn't need a grid or a network or a biometric key or anything at all, except the patient attention of someone willing to wind it. And he closed his eyes. And the cold and the silence and the steady mechanical ticking of the only thing still working exactly as intended moved together into a kind of peace, which was not happiness but was something honest, and was, in the end, enough. Outside, the Vela anomaly sat in the dark, a perfect, closed sphere, the door locked from the inside, the light staying where it belonged.